Gray tiles blurred. Feet rushed. Minji stood still, a singular point of stillness in the chaotic flow of travelers. Her knuckles were white, locked tight around the handle of her suitcase, as if it were the only thing grounding her to the floor. Around her, the air felt thin, recycled, and sharp, with the scent of floor wax and exhaust. Before we continue, if you love powerful real-life stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and join the channel. Have you done that? Now, let's get back into our story. Sit tight. A businessman collided with her shoulder, his briefcase clipping her arm, but she did not flinch. She did not even turn to look. Her gaze remained fixed on the sliding glass doors ahead, where the world outside waited. Every muscle in her neck was pulled taut. She shifted her weight, the wheels of her luggage clicking against the hard surface, a sharp, rhythmic sound. She took a breath, held it until her lungs burned, and then let it out slowly. She checked her watch, adjusted her grip on the handle one last time, and stepped forward into the crowd. There was no turning back now. She bypassed the taxi queue and walked toward the train platform, her pace steady and rhythmic. The terminal noise faded into a dull roar behind her, replaced by the mechanical whine of the transit system. Minji reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph, the edges softened by years of friction. She did not look at it for long. She didn't need to. The image was burned into her mind. This was not a vacation. There would be no sightseeing, no rest, and no return to the life she had carefully constructed in the years since. She was here to finish a chapter that had remained open for a decade, a jagged, unfinished story that had dictated every move she made since the day she left. The train arrived, with a hiss of pressurized air. She stepped into the carriage, finding a seat by the window as the city began to blur into a streak of light and concrete. She closed her eyes, counting the minutes until the next phase of her journey began, fully aware that the person waiting at the end of this road would change everything. The rhythmic clatter of the train tracks slowed, and the sound morphed into a different, more violent roar. It was the sound of timber snapping under intense heat. Minji felt the air in the carriage shift, turning from cool conditioned breeze to a searing, dry furnace blast. She was no longer on the train. She was back in the hallway of her home 10 years ago. The smell of burning insulation and charred wood filled her lungs, thick and acrid. She reached out to pull a heavy wooden frame from the wall, but the plaster crumbled beneath her fingertips like dry sand. The ceiling groaned, a deep, structural scream that preceded the collapse of the rafters. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the floorboards, as embers rained down, glowing like dying stars. The heat was a physical weight, pressing her against the wall until she could barely draw a breath. In a single hour, the structure that had held her world together turned to gray, swirling ash. She stood in the doorway, staring at the ruin. The smoke cleared, replaced by the relentless, dry heat of the savannah. Minji stepped off the plane and into a world of red dust and endless horizon. She left the charred remains of her past behind, trading the suffocating urban sprawl for the wide, silent plains of Kenya. Every mile she traveled away from the airport felt like shedding a layer of skin. She arrived in a small, isolated town where nobody knew her name or the history of the fire that had hollowed her out. She checked into a room with corrugated metal walls that rattled in the wind. Outside, the landscape stretched out in shades of ochre and burnt orange. She walked the perimeter of the village, her boots kicking up clouds of fine red earth that coated everything they touched. There was no noise here but the distant rustle of dry grass and the occasional call of birds. She sought anonymity in this silence, hoping the vastness of the savannah would swallow her trauma. The school was a collection of low, sun-baked structures huddled under the shade of a massive acacia tree. Minji lingered near the entrance, her boots caked in the thick red dust of the village. She watched the children move through the courtyard, their laughter sharp and bright against the heavy, stagnant heat of the afternoon. She stepped toward the open door of the main classroom. Inside, the air was cooler, smelling of dry chalk and old paper. She stayed in the shadows of the doorway, her shoulders hunched, waiting for the familiar urge to run to take hold. Then, the rhythm of the room changed. A man stood at the front of the class, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He turned, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on the doorway where she stood. He simply paused and offered a brief, steady nod. She took a single step forward, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and for the first time in years, the urge to flee receded. She took a seat at the back, pulling her knees tight against the edge of the wooden desk. The room was filled with the rustle of notebooks and the soft scrape of pencils. Samuel stood at the front, but he did not lecture from a book. He paced the length of the blackboard, his voice low and steady, weaving stories into the grammar lessons. When he spoke, he did not rush to fill the silence. He let the words land, giving the students space to absorb the meaning. Minji watched him, waiting for the demand for recitation, for the pressure of performance that had defined her life in Korea. It never came. Instead, he stopped at each desk, checking progress with a touch on a shoulder or a quiet suggestion. He looked toward the back of the room, catching her gaze, and continued his rhythm. He was teaching them how to articulate their thoughts, but more importantly, he was teaching them how to exhale. The tension in her chest, a constant companion since the fire, began to loosen. The lesson continued, but Minji was no longer tracking the words on the board. Her hands rested on the scarred wood of the desk, and she could not stop them from shaking. The tremors were a remnant of a life she had tried to leave behind, a physical manifestation of the fire that still burned in her memory. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles turning pale, trying to force her body into stillness. She felt exposed, certain that everyone in the room could see the instability radiating from her. Samuel was moving between the rows of students, his pace unhurried and rhythmic. He stopped near her desk, his shadow falling across her notebook. He did not look at her hands, nor did he ask the question she dreaded. Instead, he walked to the corner of the room, filled a glass from a pitcher, and returned. He set the glass down on the corner of her desk with a soft, deliberate click. The water was clear, catching the afternoon light. He did not speak. He simply offered a slight nod, a gesture that acknowledged her presence without demanding anything in return. The glass sat there, a cool, transparent weight against the heat of the room. It was a simple offering, yet it anchored her to the present moment, cutting through the static of her own internal chaos. The tremors persisted, a rhythmic vibration that traveled from her shoulders down to her fingertips. She stared at the glass of water, watching the surface tension of the liquid. It was perfectly still, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cool glass, and felt the condensation dampen her skin. She lifted it, her hand wobbling, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was room temperature, grounding her as it moved down her throat. She focused entirely on the sensation of swallowing, forcing her lungs to expand and contract in time with the quiet rhythm of the room. One breath, then another. She felt the muscles in her jaw unclench, the sharp edge of her panic dulling into a manageable hum. She set the glass back down, the click against the wood sounding louder than before. Her hands remained on the desk, fingers splayed flat against the surface. The shaking had stopped. She looked up, her gaze steadying as she finally met the ambient light of the room without flinching. The air felt thinner, easier to pull into her lungs. For the first time in years, the silence of the savannah did not feel like an empty void, but a space she could finally inhabit. The classroom routine settled into a predictable, steady pulse. Minji no longer felt the need to fill the gaps in the day with frantic activity or forced conversation. She spent hours in the back row, simply watching the way the light shifted across the floorboards. Samuel often stood by the window, his attention divided between the students and the vast, open horizon beyond the glass. They existed in a shared orbit of quiet. When he walked past her desk to collect assignments, he would pause for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering near her notebook before he moved on. It was not a gesture that required an answer. It was a recognition of a mutual understanding that had taken root in the stillness. They watched the same dust motes dance in the shafts of golden light, drifting through the air in slow, aimless loops. There was no pressure to perform, or to explain the wreckage of the past. The silence was not empty. It was a weight that held them both in place. He was the anchor, and she was finally learning how to stop drifting. The classroom walls eventually gave way to the sprawling expanse of the savannah. Under the wide, flat canopy of an ancient acacia tree, the lessons continued with a different rhythm. Minji watched from a distance as Samuel knelt in the dirt, his knees pressing into the dry earth. He held an open book, his finger tracing the lines of text. As her children leaned in, their heads nearly touching his shoulders, one of the younger ones pulled back, hesitant, eyes darting toward the horizon. But Samuel did not rush. He simply tapped the page, pointed to a drawing of a bird, and waited. The child moved closer, the initial barrier of uncertainty dissolving into the dust. Samuel began to read, his voice low and steady, blending with the distant hum of insects and the rustle of dry grass. He taught them to sound out words, his patience acting as a bridge between their confusion and the clarity of the stories. He showed them how to hold the book, how to turn the pages without tearing them, and how to find meaning in the ink. Minji observed the way he adjusted his posture to shield them from the shifting sun, his presence creating a pocket of safety. In the vast, open landscape, the children looked up at him with unreserved curiosity, and in that exchange, the foundation of a new, unexpected family began to take hold. The lessons under the acacia tree became the heartbeat of their days. Minji sat on a nearby rock, watching the way the sunlight filtered through the branches, casting shifting patterns across the children's faces. They were no longer the guarded, anxious figures who had arrived in the village months ago. Now, they sat cross-legged around Samuel, their hands eagerly reaching for the books he brought. When he asked a question, they didn't look to Minji for permission. They looked to him. She watched her son point at a word, his finger trembling slightly with effort, and saw Samuel nod with a slow, encouraging smile. The boy laughed, a sound that had been absent for years, and leaned against Samuel's side. It was a simple, unforced movement, yet it shattered the last of Minji's internal defenses. She realized then that the children had stopped searching for the life they lost, and were instead building a future in this patch of shade. Samuel was not just teaching them to read, he was teaching them how to belong. As the sun began to dip, painting the horizon in shades of violet and gold, she stood up and walked toward them. She didn't need to speak. She simply stood at the edge of their circle, watching the way they looked at him, and finally understood that they had become a family. The departure was not a choice, but a necessity that arrived with the weight of a closing door. Minji stood on the tarmac, the heat of the savannah still clinging to her skin, while the metal fuselage of the plane loomed ahead. She looked back one final time, but the village was already lost to the haze of the horizon. Inside the cabin, the air was thin and recycled, a sharp contrast to the dust-filled breeze she had grown to love. As the engines roared to life, she pressed her palm against the cold window, watching the ground fall away until the world became a blur of muted colors. The hours in the air were marked by a hollow silence. She reached for the book Samuel had given her, but the pages felt heavy. When the plane finally touched down in Korea, the transition was jarring. The terminal was a landscape of polished gray tiles and rushing crowds. She stepped off the gangway and into the terminal, her suitcase handle digging into her palm. The distance was no longer a measurement on a map. It was a physical ache. Seoul demanded a rhythm she no longer possessed. Every morning, the subway doors slid open with a metallic hiss that echoed the silence of the savannah, pulling her back to the shade of the acacia tree. She walked the gray streets, but her mind remained anchored in the red dust. At a local cafe, the scent of roasted beans triggered a sudden, vivid image of Samuel pouring water into a glass, his movements precise and unhurried. She reached for her cup, but her fingers brushed the cold ceramic, and the phantom warmth vanished. Back in her apartment, she sat at a small wooden table, trying to focus on her work. But the silence of the room was heavy and suffocating. She closed her eyes, listening for the sound of his voice explaining a lesson, but heard only the distant, relentless hum of city traffic. She found herself tracing the grain of the wood, searching for the texture of the desk where they had once sat together. She tried to fill the void with the old blueprints of her life, She returned to her former office, sat at her desk, and opened the files that once defined her ambition. The numbers on the screen were clear, yet they meant nothing. At a dinner with old friends, the conversation flowed around her like a river she could not enter. They spoke of promotions, real estate, and the frantic pace of the city, their voices sharp and demanding. When a colleague asked about her time away, she opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt like lead. She looked at their faces, polished and expectant, and realized she was looking at strangers. She excused herself, stepping onto the balcony to escape the suffocating warmth of the room. The city lights stretched out below, a sea of artificial stars that offered no guidance. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was not healing. She was merely waiting for a life that had ended months ago in the red dust. The apartment felt like a museum of a person she no longer was. Minji stood in the center of the living room, the silence no longer suffocating but clear. She walked to her desk and swept the stack of business files into the trash. The sound of paper hitting the bin was the loudest thing she had heard in weeks. She didn't hesitate. She pulled her suitcase from the back of the closet, the wheels clicking against the floorboards as she dragged it into the light. She began to pack, not with the frantic energy of a tourist, but with the cold, sharp focus of someone burning their bridges. She only took what was necessary. Her hands moved with a sudden, terrifying grace. She opened her laptop, the screen illuminating her face in the dim room, and navigated to the airline portal. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, then tapped the final confirmation. She closed the lid, the darkness returning to the room. She grabbed her coat, stepped out, and locked the door, leaving the key on the mat. The transition was absolute. The sterile, climate-controlled air of the international terminal vanished, replaced by the heavy, sun-baked heat of the savannah. Minji stepped off the transport vehicle, her boots sinking into the fine, ochre-colored dust that coated everything. The engine sputtered and died, leaving her in a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. She stood still, letting the wind pull at her hair, tasting the familiar grit of the earth on her tongue. The horizon stretched out, a vast expanse of gold and burnt orange that seemed to vibrate under the midday sun. She adjusted the weight of her bag and began to walk. The path was uneven, marked by the passage of cattle. She passed the familiar acacia trees, their branches twisted into shapes she remembered from a decade ago. The landscape had not changed, but she had. The distance she had traveled was measured in the slow, agonizing reconstruction of her own resolve. As she crested the final ridge, the village came into view. She stopped, her breath hitching, as the scent of wood smoke drifted toward her. The village path narrowed, winding between huts until the familiar structure stood before her. It was weathered, the wood bleached by years of relentless sun and scarred by the seasonal rains. Minji stopped 10 paces away. The silence of the village was absolute, broken only by the distant bleat of a goat and the rhythmic sound of her own pulse. She felt the weight of her suitcase handle, the plastic digging into her palm, a physical anchor to the life she had left behind. She took a step, then another, the dust settling around her boots. Her throat felt dry, constricted by the words she had rehearsed for thousands of miles. She reached the threshold and stopped. A deep, jagged crack ran down the center of the door, a testament to the passage of time. She looked at the latch, a simple iron piece, and felt her resolve flicker. If she knocked, there was no turning back. She raised her hand, her fingers trembling, and hovered just inches from the rough surface. She closed her eyes, inhaled the scent of dry earth and wood smoke, and forced her hand forward. Minji knocked. The sound was sharp, a sudden intrusion into the stillness of the afternoon. She pulled her hand back, her knuckles stinging from the impact against the hardened wood. She waited. 5 seconds stretched into 10, then 20. The silence returned, thicker than before, pressing against her ears. She leaned back, her breath hitching, and for a fleeting moment, she turned toward the path, ready to flee. Then, a heavy thud vibrated through the frame. The latch groaned, a metallic protest against years of disuse. The door swung inward, revealing a sliver of shadow that quickly widened into the dim interior of the room. Samuel stood there. He was mid-motion, a book held loosely in his left hand, his expression shifting from casual indifference to absolute, frozen disbelief. The book slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a dull thud. He did not speak. His eyes locked onto hers, scanning her face as if searching for a ghost. The air between them seemed to warp, the decade of distance collapsing into a single suffocating heartbeat. Minji stepped across the threshold, the transition from the harsh exterior light to the dim room making her blink. She did not wait for an invitation. The air inside smelled of dust and old paper. She stood before him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide the tremor in her fingers. Samuel remained motionless, his gaze fixed on her, but he did not offer a greeting. She saw the way his chest rose and fell, a slow, controlled rhythm. She needed to break the wall between them. She reached out, her hand hovering near his arm before she pulled it back, settling for the space between them. She did not speak of the years, or the distance, or the pain of the fire. She looked him directly in the eye and laid her purpose bare. She told him that she had not come for a visit, nor for a simple thank you. She asked him to leave. She asked him to walk away from the classroom, the village, and the life he had built, and to follow her back to a place that would never accept him. Samuel did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room. He looked at the stacks of graded papers on his desk, the worn wooden chairs, and the small shelf filled with books he had collected. Every object held a story, a connection to the people who relied on him every single morning. He walked past Minji, his movements deliberate, and stopped at the window. Outside, the village was waking up. He pointed toward the path where children were already gathering, their voices carrying through the thin walls. He looked at her then, and the expression in his eyes was not anger, but a profound, quiet sorrow. He traced the grain of the window frame with his thumb, a gesture of ownership and belonging. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of everything he had become in her absence. Minji did not retreat. She felt the coldness of his resolve, but she pushed against it, stepping forward until the space between them vanished. She began to speak, the words spilling out with a frantic, jagged rhythm that shattered the quiet. She laid bare the decade of emptiness she had carried, the way his memory had acted as the only anchor in her life. She confessed that she had spent 10 years waiting for a signal, a sign, anything to justify the ache in her chest. She told him that the life she lived in Korea was a hollow shell, a performance she could no longer maintain. Her voice grew tighter, rising in pitch as she described the suffocating expectations of her world and how only his presence had ever made her feel human. She reached out, grasping the edge of his table, her knuckles straining against the wood. The air in the room seemed to thicken, turning stagnant and dense. Every breath she took felt like an effort, as if the oxygen were being drained by the sheer force of her admission. She watched his face, searching for a crack in his composure. Samuel did not move toward her. Instead, he recoiled, his heels scraping against the floorboards as he put immediate distance between them. The suddenness of his retreat was a physical blow. He pulled his shoulders back, locking his spine into a rigid, defensive line that turned his body into a wall. His hands, once steady and welcoming, now gripped his own elbows, anchoring him in place. He looked at her, but his gaze was no longer soft. It was guarded, sharpened by the sudden realization of the chasm that had opened between them. Every muscle in his frame tightened, signaling a firm, immovable boundary. He stood like a statue, carved from the very earth of the village, his posture radiating a defiance that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the world he had built. He did not speak, but his stillness was a loud, clear rejection. He shifted his weight, his feet planted firmly, refusing to yield an inch of the space he occupied. The air, previously heavy with her confession, now crackled with the friction of his withdrawal. He was no longer the man who had offered her water. He was a man protecting his reality from an encroaching storm. His rigid posture held firm, a silent testament to the vast, unbridgeable distance. Samuel finally broke the silence, his voice low and raspy, carrying the weight of a man who had long ago calculated the cost of such a dream. He spoke of Seoul, not as the home she remembered, but as a landscape of sharp edges and unforgiving eyes. He described the stairs that would follow them down every street, a relentless, silent judgment that would strip away their privacy. He spoke of the whispers, the way words would coil around them like smoke, choking the life out of their bond before it could even take root. He gestured toward the window, toward the village that knew him, contrasting its quiet acceptance with the cold, rigid traditions of her city. He laid out the reality of the stairs, the exclusion, and the way society would treat their union as a stain to be scrubbed away. He painted a picture of a life lived in the shadows, where every public interaction would be a battle, and every moment of peace would be stolen. He looked at her, his expression unyielding, forcing her to see the wall he was describing, a wall built of prejudice. Minji did not retreat. She did not argue. She simply stepped forward, closing the gap he had fought so hard to maintain. The air in the room seemed to thin as she moved, her focus narrowing entirely to the man standing before her. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly before they found his. She pressed her hand firmly against his, her pale skin a stark, undeniable contrast against his dark palm. She held the grip tight, anchoring herself to him. He looked down at their joined hands, his breath hitching in the sudden quiet. She did not pull away when he stiffened. Instead, she leaned in, forcing him to acknowledge the warmth of her touch. It was a silent, desperate declaration. She was not listening to the logic of the world anymore. She was listening to the pulse beneath his skin. Her thumb brushed against his knuckles. She held his gaze, refusing to let him look away. She was not asking for permission. She was claiming a future that he had tried to bury. They stepped out into the village square, but the air outside was no longer the air they knew. The transition was immediate. A group of men sitting near the well stopped their conversation mid-sentence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy. Minji felt the shift in the atmosphere, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Samuel kept his hand in hers, but his stride had lost its natural rhythm. Every few steps, they passed neighbors who had known Samuel for years. Yet now, those same faces turned toward the ground or looked through them. A woman carrying a basket of grain paused, her eyes darting between them before she pivoted sharply and walked the other way. The path ahead felt narrower than it had an hour ago. The village was no longer a collection of homes. It had become a gallery of spectators. The whispers began low, rhythmic, and indistinguishable, like the buzzing of insects just out of sight. It was a wall built of averted gazes. Minji gripped Samuel's hand tighter, feeling the sweat on his palm. The stigma was no longer an abstract fear. It was a physical weight. The center of the square offered no shelter. The sun beat down, turning the dust into a blinding white haze. Minji stopped, her boots sinking into the dry earth. She looked for a familiar face, but found only blank stares. An elder stood near the path, his hands clasped behind his back. As they approached, he did not offer the customary greeting. Instead, he stepped aside, creating a deliberate, wide arc to avoid brushing against them. The movement was slow, calculated, and final. It was a physical rejection that echoed louder than any shout. Minji watched him walk away, his back rigid, his pace steady. She looked at Samuel. He was staring straight ahead, his jaw set, his muscles coiled tight. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure against her eardrums. She gripped Samuel's hand, her knuckles aching, and finally understood the true scale of the battle she had invited into their lives. The silence in the square was brittle, ready to snap at the slightest touch. Minji stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the horizon, but her mind was tethered to the device in her pocket. The heat radiated from the ground, shimmering in waves that distorted the shapes of the distant huts. Samuel remained at her side, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling uncertainty. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then shifted his gaze to the path leading out of the village. He knew the pressure was mounting. A sharp, rhythmic vibration pulsed against Minji's thigh, breaking the stillness. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal of the phone. She pulled it out. The screen lit up, displaying the name that had haunted her thoughts for weeks: her family. The vibration continued, a persistent, mechanical demand for attention. She looked at Samuel. He saw the name on the screen and stepped back, giving her the space to decide. The air around them seemed to thicken, the weight of the coming conversation pressing down on the square. She held the phone, the screen glowing against the harsh midday light. She drew a breath, her thumb hovering over the accept button. Minji pressed the green icon. The screen flashed, then went black for a heartbeat before the call connected. A sharp, high-pitched static burst from the speaker, a jagged sound that tore through the quiet of the square. She winced, pulling the device slightly away from her ear before pressing it back firmly. Her thumb traced the edge of the glass, her skin damp with sweat. She stood perfectly still, her eyes locked onto the dusty path ahead, refusing to look at Samuel. The connection stabilized, and the ambient noise of a distant, bustling city filtered through the line, the hum of traffic, the muffled chatter of a crowd a world away from the savannah. She cleared her throat, but no sound came out. The weight of the phone felt immense, a leaden anchor in her hand. She shifted her weight, the dry earth crunching beneath her boots. Then, the voice on the other end broke the silence. It was cold, precise, and devoid of the warmth she had once known. Minji's grip tightened until her knuckles turned ivory. She did not speak. She simply listened, the digital signal carrying the ultimatum across thousands of miles. The words came through the speaker with clinical detachment. They did not ask about her health or her time away. They spoke only of the family name, the social standing in Seoul, and the absolute line that could not be crossed. The voice grew louder, sharper, cutting through the ambient hum of the line. It laid out the terms with terrifying clarity. If she chose to remain here, if she chose to bring a man from outside their world into the family fold, the connection would be severed forever. There would be no return, no inheritance, no recognition. She would be a ghost to them, a name erased from the family registry. Minji felt the ground beneath her feet seem to tilt. The ultimatum hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating presence that eclipsed the sun. She watched Samuel standing a few paces away, his face etched with a quiet, painful understanding of what was being demanded of her. The voice on the phone continued, detailing the shame she would bring upon them. She stood in the center of the square, listening to the finality of their rejection. The voice on the line did not falter. It delivered the final verdict with the chilling precision of a judge signing a death warrant. There was no room for negotiation, no space for a plea. They called her a stranger, a disappointment, a shadow that no longer belonged in their home. The words were stripped of all familial warmth, reduced to a cold, transactional dismissal. She heard the sharp intake of breath on the other side, a final, audible sign of disgust before the line went dead. The sudden absence of sound was deafening. The digital hum vanished, replaced by the dry, rasping wind of the savannah. Minji pulled the phone away from her ear, staring at the blank, dark screen as if it held the map of her ruined future. Her hand trembled, the plastic casing slick with her own sweat. She stood in the center of the square, the vast, open sky above her feeling suddenly heavy and oppressive. The connection to her past had been severed, not by distance, but by the deliberate, calculated choice of those who had raised her. The silence of the village pressed in on her. Samuel did not move toward her immediately. He remained anchored in the dust, his weight shifted slightly to one side, watching her with a stillness that felt like a sanctuary. His eyes were dark, steady, and filled with a raw, aching recognition of the price she had just paid. He saw the way her fingers locked around the phone, the way her shoulders rose and fell in shallow, jagged breaths. There was no pity in his face, only a profound, heavy understanding that mirrored the devastation she felt. He knew the weight of the words she had just heard without needing to be told. He had seen this kind of loss before, the way it hollowed a person out from the inside. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his hands hanging loose at his sides, signaling that he was not there to offer a solution, but to share the burden. The sunlight caught the lines around his eyes, deepening the exhaustion he carried for her. He watched her struggle to find her footing in the silence, his gaze never wavering, offering a quiet, unwavering presence. He was the only witness to the final severance of her old life, and in his steady, mournful look, she found the first tremor of a new, terrifying freedom. The name she had carried for 30 years suddenly felt like a label on a stranger's luggage. Minji looked down at her own hands, the skin appearing alien against the red earth of the savannah. She tried to summon the image of her childhood home, the specific scent of the morning air in Seoul, but the memory was a locked door. The rejection had not just cut her off from her family, it had scraped away the foundation of who she believed she was. She felt the structure of her identity buckling under the weight of the silence. Every expectation she had ever met, every duty she had ever performed, now felt like a debt she no longer owed to a ghost. Her pulse hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that defied the stillness of the village. She was a woman caught between two worlds, and both were currently dissolving. The heritage that once defined her was now a jagged shard, cutting into her resolve. She closed her eyes, trying to anchor herself to the ground, but the earth felt loose and shifting. She was no longer the daughter they demanded, nor the woman she had been before the fire. She was something raw, unformed, and terrifyingly new, standing in the center of a life that had suddenly become a blank, terrifying slate. The silence in the square shifted. It was no longer empty. It was occupied. From the doorways of the low-slung huts, figures emerged, moving with a slow, deliberate cadence. They did not speak, yet the air grew thick with their collective observation. Minji felt the prickle of dozens of eyes against her skin, a heavy, unblinking gaze that measured her presence and found it wanting. The villagers stood in a loose circle, their forms silhouetted against the fading light, creating a perimeter she could not cross. Samuel remained at her side, his posture unyielding, but she saw the way his jaw tightened as the crowd pressed in. This was not a physical threat, but a social one. A wall of quiet judgment that made the space between them and the rest of the world feel like an abyss. Every breath she took felt exposed, scrutinized by people who had known Samuel for years and now saw an outsider disrupting the order of their lives. The whispers began, low and rhythmic. They were trapped in the center of a circle that refused to let them pass, waiting for her to break. Minji looked down at the device in her palm. The screen was dark, the voice on the other end a fading echo of a life she no longer inhabited. She did not hesitate. Her fingers opened, and the phone fell, landing with a dull thud in the red dust. The sound was small, yet it seemed to ring across the square. The villagers shifted, their collective gaze sharpening as she turned away from the path that led back to her old world. She stepped toward Samuel. She reached out, her fingers finding his, and gripped his hand with a force that left no room for doubt. He looked at her, the tension in his shoulders finally breaking. He did not speak, but he turned with her, his stride matching hers as they began to walk. The circle of onlookers did not cheer, nor did they move to block the way. They simply stepped back, creating a narrow lane that led toward the open savannah. The sun was dipping low, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out before them like a map. They walked past the huts, past the silent observers, and out toward the edge of the village where the horizon waited. Every step was a declaration, a deliberate movement away from the expectations of others and toward a future they would build together in the quiet, vast expanse of the plains. The village lights flickered and vanished behind a rise in the land, leaving only the vast, rhythmic sound of the wind through the tall grass. Minji did not look back. Her hand remained locked in Samuel's, their palms slick with sweat and the heat of the long day. They walked until the ground turned from packed earth to soft, uneven scrub. The transition was absolute. Behind them lay the life she had tried to reclaim. Ahead lay a path that had no map. They stopped for a moment near a cluster of acacia trees, the branches skeletal against the rising moon. Samuel took a deep breath, his chest expanding, and for the first time, he let out a low, steady exhale that seemed to release the last of his hesitation. He squeezed her hand, a firm, grounding pressure that anchored her in the present. They were no longer the people who had stood in that square. They were moving into the dark, not as fugitives, but as architects of their own future. Each step they took into the savannah was a deliberate act of creation. The horizon stretched endlessly, a dark line where the earth met the star-dusted sky. They climbed the ridge, the gravel shifting beneath their boots with every upward push. At the crest, they paused. Below, the village was nothing more than a faint, flickering amber glow, a dying ember of the world they had abandoned. Minji felt the cool night air pull at her skin, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of the square. She looked at the distance, then at Samuel. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the path ahead where the moon illuminated the tall, swaying grass. There was no turning back. The choice was made, and the weight of it had settled into a steady, quiet resolve. They turned their backs on the glow, descending the far side. The sound of their footsteps was rhythmic, steady, and certain. They moved with purpose, navigating by the stars. They walked until the village lights were extinguished by the curvature of the earth, leaving them alone in the silence. The sky began to bleed from deep indigo into a pale, bruised violet. They reached a dry riverbed where a small pool remained, fed by hidden springs. Minji knelt, the grit of the sand pressing into her knees. She cupped the water, the surface tension breaking under her touch, and splashed it over her face. The cold shock cleared the lingering fatigue of the long night. Samuel knelt beside her, his hands steady as he dipped his own palms into the pool. They drank, the water sharp and metallic, grounding them in the reality of the earth beneath them. As they stood, the first sliver of the sun crested the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the savannah. The light caught the dust motes, dancing in the air, illuminating the path ahead. They did not speak. There was no need for words when the horizon itself demanded their attention. They stepped out of the riverbed, their boots crunching on the dry stones, and moved toward the rising sun. The landscape opened up, vast and unyielding, offering no shelter and no judgment. They walked forward, their pace steady, their focus fixed on the distance. The past was a shadow left behind in the dark, and the future was a wide, golden expanse waiting for their footprints. The terrain shifted from flat plains to a rocky, rising plateau. Each step required more effort, the incline forcing them to lean into the climb. Minji reached the summit first, her breath coming in sharp, controlled bursts. She waited for Samuel, watching him navigate the loose shale. When he reached the top, they both stood still, surveying the world below. The savannah stretched out like a sea of amber and gold, broken only by the occasional acacia. Minji set her bag down, the leather straps biting into her shoulders, and tightened the buckles. Samuel checked the horizon, his hand shielding his eyes. They were miles from any road, any village, or any expectation. The wind whipped across the plateau, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. They picked up their packs, the weight familiar now, and turned toward the western edge of the plateau. There was no map, only the steady pull of the path they were creating. They walked until their figures became small, then smaller still, against the vast backdrop of the earth. The horizon swallowed them whole, leaving only the sound of the wind and the rhythmic crunch of boots on stone. They were gone, moving toward a future that belonged to no one but themselves. The plateau ended abruptly, dropping into a lush, hidden valley shielded by limestone cliffs. The descent was steep, requiring them to use their hands to steady their progress against the rock face. Minji felt the grit of the stone beneath her palms. the texture rough and cooling in the shade of the overhang. They reached a flat ledge halfway down, a natural vantage point overlooking the valley floor. Samuel pointed toward a cluster of trees near a winding stream, a clear marker for their next leg. They stood there for a moment, listening to the distant rush of water, the sound amplified by the canyon walls. They resumed the descent, their boots finding purchase on the loose scree. Each step took them further from the world they had known, deeper into the quiet of the valley. They reached the base, where the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and blooming scrub. They walked toward the stream, their movements synchronized and deliberate. They crossed the water, the current swirling around their ankles, and stepped onto the soft bank on the other side. They did not look back. Their footprints pressed into the damp soil, clear and deep. The valley opened into a wide, grassy basin as the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon. They stopped near a cluster of boulders that broke the wind. Minji knelt and cleared a circle in the dirt, scraping away the dry grass with her hands. Samuel gathered dead branches from the nearby scrub, his movements rhythmic and efficient. He stacked the wood, struck a spark against a piece of flint, and watched the first thin plume of smoke rise into the cooling air. The fire caught, casting a flickering glow against the stone and their faces. They sat on the ground, the warmth of the flames pushing back the encroaching chill. Minji watched the embers drift upward, disappearing into the vast, star-strewn sky. They did not speak. The silence was no longer a weight, but a foundation. They were two figures anchored in the dark, carving a space out of the wild. The first light of dawn touched the basin, turning the dew on the grass into silver needles. Minji stood, her joints stiff from the cold, and began to break down the fire circle. She buried the ashes, smoothing the earth, until no trace of their presence remained. Samuel gathered their few supplies, checking the straps on their packs with practiced, steady motions. They did not look toward the valley they had left behind. Instead, they turned east, where the sun was beginning to bleed over the jagged rim of the mountains. The air was sharp and thin, biting at their skin as they stepped away from the boulders. They walked in silence, their boots crunching against the dry, sun-baked earth. Every movement was deliberate, a rhythm established over days of travel. They reached the crest of a low ridge and paused, looking out over the vast, rolling plains that stretched toward the horizon. There were no roads here, only the endless expanse. The terrain leveled into a fertile plateau, fed by a narrow, perennial stream. They stopped where the water pooled against a bank of dark, rich silt. Minji set her pack down and gripped the handle of a heavy iron spade. She drove the blade into the earth, her shoulders tensing as she pried up a thick clod of grass and roots. Samuel knelt beside her, clearing the debris with his bare hands, his fingers digging deep into the damp soil. They worked in a steady, synchronized rhythm, turning the ground over until a long, dark furrow stretched across the clearing. The sun climbed high, baking the sweat onto their skin. But they did not stop. They moved to the next row, the metal of the spade ringing against the occasional stone. When the plot was cleared, they took a handful of seeds from a small pouch. Minji dropped them into the furrows, covering them with a light layer of dirt. They stood up, breathing hard, and looked at the patch of ground. It was no longer wild. It was a beginning. Months passed, and the green shoots grew into tall stalks. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl across the plateau. Minji and Samuel heard the warning in the shifting pressure of the air. They ran to the field, grabbing heavy canvas sheets and wooden stakes. The rain started as hard, stinging pellets, turning the dust into slick mud. They worked in the downpour, driving the stakes deep into the saturated ground, and lashing the canvas tight over the crops. The wind whipped the fabric, pulling at their arms, but they held the lines taut until the structure groaned and held. They huddled beneath the shelter, listening to the roar of the storm against the canvas. When the clouds finally broke, the sun returned, casting a golden light. Over the wet, glistening leaves. They emerged from the shelter, their boots caked in thick clay. They walked the rows, checking the ties. The harvest was safe. They stood at the edge of the field, watching the light fade behind the distant hills. They were tired, their hands calloused and stained. It was home. They turned back toward their dwelling as the first stars appeared, their silhouettes steady against the vast, quiet landscape. The sun rose over the plateau, casting long shadows across the rows of grain. Minji stepped out of the dwelling, the cool morning air biting at her skin. She walked to the water barrel, tipped the ladle, and drank. Samuel was already at the edge of the field, his back to her, clearing a patch of stubborn weeds. She joined him, the soil yielding beneath her boots. They worked for hours without speaking, the only sounds the rhythmic scrape of metal against earth, and the distant call of birds. By midday, the heat forced them to seek the shade of the acacia tree. They sat on the dry grass, sharing a simple meal of flatbread and fruit. Minji watched the horizon, where the land met the sky in a seamless line. She reached out, her fingers brushing the rough bark of the tree, then rested her hand on the ground. Samuel looked at her, his expression unreadable, and nodded once. He stood up, offering a hand to pull her to her feet. They walked back toward the field, their movements synchronized by years of shared labor. The work was endless, but it was theirs. As the light turned amber, they stood at the center of the plot, surrounded by the life they had nurtured from the dust. The light retreated from the plateau, leaving the sky a deep, bruised indigo. Minji latched the heavy wooden door, the bolt sliding home with a solid, final thud. Inside, the air held the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. She struck a match, the flame flaring to life and catching the wick of the oil lamp. Samuel stood by the small table, setting down the tools he had carried from the field. He moved with a slow, deliberate cadence, his joints stiff from the day's labor. Minji poured water into 2 metal cups and placed them on the table. They sat on the low stools, the silence between them thick and comfortable. Minji watched the shadows dance against the rafters, then looked at Samuel. He reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The calluses on his palms pressed against her skin, a physical reminder of the years they had spent building this space. They did not speak. They blew out the lamp together, plunging the room into darkness. The only sound was the steady, synchronized rhythm of their breathing. The first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Minji pushed the door open, the hinges groaning as they swung wide. A light rain had fallen during the night, leaving the ground dark and saturated. She stepped onto the threshold, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. Samuel followed, carrying the water buckets. They walked toward the well, their path marked by the impressions they left in the mud. The air was cool, smelling of wet stone and crushed grass. They reached the well, the rope slick under their hands as they lowered the bucket. The water splashed against the sides, a sharp, clear sound in the morning stillness. They worked in tandem, pulling the weight up, the rhythm of their movements steady and practiced. They did not look back at the dwelling. Their focus remained on the path ahead, winding through the trees toward the edge of the plateau. They moved with purpose, leaving the shelter of the past behind. They reached the crest of the hill, stopped, and looked out at the vast, open expanse. They turned, walked forward, and disappeared into the light. The path they carved into the earth remained, a thin, winding line cutting through the tall grass. The sun climbed higher, baking the mud until the footprints hardened into permanent impressions. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sweeping across the spot where they had stood only moments before. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant rain, rustling the leaves of the acacia trees. Silence reclaimed the clearing. The village in the distance was a cluster of brown shapes against the green savanna, quiet and still. There were no voices, no movement. The sun hit the crest of the hill, turning the dust into a golden haze that obscured the trail. Everything they had left behind was now miles away. The light intensified, washing out the details of the trail until only the horizon remained, clear and empty. If you love powerful real-life stories like this, kindly subscribe to this channel.